Good afternoon and welcome to this web event with the American Enterprise Institute. I'm Katherine Zimmerman and I'm a fellow at AEI specializing in the Salafi Jihadi movement as well as Yemen and parts of Africa. And I'm thrilled today to host Ambassador Sales, who is the coordinator for counterterrorism, along with Bruce Hoffman, who is a senior fellow at the Council for Foreign Relations, The terrorism threat has changed dramatically over the past few years, and I would say the most dramatic changes since the events of 9/11, which has caused challenges for US counterterrorism policy. Ambassador Sales is going to give a speech outlining the major counterterrorism successes that we've had in recent years in our international counterterrorism policy, as well as some of the challenges that he sees looking at the future. Ambassador Sales is currently the coordinator for counterterrorism and is also the principal advisor to the Secretary of State on international counterterrorism matters. Recently, he was named the special envoy to the Global Coalition to Defeat ISIS. Before he came to state, and long before, he was a tenured law professor and worked on counterterrorism issues, national security issues, and constitutional law. Briefly, Bruce Hoffman is the senior fellow at for counterterrorism and homeland security at the Council on Foreign Relations. He's also the director of the Center for Jewish Civilization at Georgetown University's School of Foreign Service. You can find their full bios on the AEI web event page, and I'm thrilled to have both of them here to discuss since they are certainly experts in the field. We are going to have Ambassador Sales speak, and then Bruce and I will join him for a conversation before opening up to questions from the audience. In this format, to submit questions, please email them to chris.gavin@aei.org or submit them via our Twitter hashtag, which is hashtag #StateCT@AEI. And I will turn the podium over to Ambassador Sales now.
Well, thanks very much. I'd like to thank AEI, first of all, for giving me this opportunity to speak with you all today. And special thanks to Katie and Bruce for sharing the stage with me. I guess I should say virtual stage, but it's good to all be together to have this important conversation. Now, before I start, I'd be remiss if I didn't say a few words about what happened here in Washington last week. Let me repeat for you what I said to my team here at the State Department. The assault on the Capitol wasn't just an assault on the Capitol. It was an assault on democracy, with a violent mob attempting to interfere with the results of the election. Nothing is more sacred to our constitutional democracy than the peaceful transfer of power. As our nation's ambassador for counterterrorism, my job is to help our partners around the world build the capacity to fight terrorism through the rule of law. It is with great satisfaction and more than a little righteous anger that I watch my colleagues at the Justice Department and FBI enforce the rule of law here at home against those who desecrated the Capitol and the principles for which it stands. Today, I'm going to talk about some of the administration's most important achievements in the fight against international terrorism. But to appreciate the state of play today, we need to recall where things stood 4 years ago. In 2017, we faced a stark threat environment. ISIS controlled vast swaths of territory in Syria and Iraq. It had spread its tentacles to Africa and Asia, while also striking in the US and in Europe. Al-Qaeda was wounded by the killing of bin Laden, but was quietly rebuilding. Iran was taking advantage of the JCPOA sanctions relief to increase funding to its terrorist proxies and to further its global campaign of violence and assassinations. Make no mistake, in 2021, we still face an array of determined and capable adversaries. But over the past 4 years, we've made significant progress in degrading the world's most dangerous terrorist groups. Today, I'd like to highlight some of these achievements, focusing on 4 particular areas. First, taking terrorists off the battlefield. Second, cutting off the flow of money to terrorists. Third, hardening borders to protect against terrorist travel. And fourth, promoting law enforcement finishes to terrorist threats. I'll also look ahead at what needs to be done in the future to preserve and build on these successes. The battlefield is where our strategy begins. Consistent with domestic and international law, the United States conducts military operations against terrorists who pose the greatest threat to our people and our interests. This administration built on the successes of our predecessors, but we also took a new approach. We empowered our commanders on the front lines by devolving certain authorities from Washington, allowing them to take the fight to our enemies. At the same time, we remained committed to protecting civilians. Not only is this the right thing to do and consistent with international law, we also knew that any other approach could feed terrorist narratives and stoke recruitment. And it could undermine the trust with foreign partners that's needed to enable successful and sustainable counterterrorism pressure. These policy changes have had a significant impact, greatly degrading the threats we face. Let's start with ISIS. The United States, in close cooperation with Iraqi and coalition partners, eradicated the so-called territorial caliphate, an area approximately 42,000 square miles. That's the size of Pennsylvania, by the way. We liberated nearly 8 million men, women, and children from ISIS's reign of terror. 4 million displaced Iraqis have been able to return home, and we eliminated the former emir of ISIS, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, in 2019. Our victory was also enabled by key contributions from the global coalition, perhaps the most successful multilateral counterterrorism platform in history. Over the last 4 years, the US-led coalition has grown to 83 members, with Mauritania becoming the most recent to join last November. I was proud to have been tapped by Secretary Pompeo as special presidential envoy to the coalition late last year. At the same time, we've remained focused on al-Qaeda. We've eliminated numerous AQ leaders, weakening the organization as well as its affiliates. That includes Hamza bin Laden, Osama's son and potential successor, as well as AQ commander Jamal al-Badawi, who was behind the USS Cole bombing. And as Secretary Pompeo confirmed earlier this week, another senior AQ leader was killed last year, Abu Muhammad al-Masri, AQ's worldwide #2, who was living in Iran. Now, it shouldn't come as a surprise that one of AQ's top leaders was in Iran. According to newly declassified information, since 2015, Iran has been al-Qaeda's de facto headquarters. While our military has won some extraordinary victories, counterterrorism is a whole of government effort. Civilian tools are just as important as the military ones. So let me drill down a bit on what we at the State Department have been doing over the past 4 years to contribute to this fight. First, designations are one of our most essential counterterrorism tools. Money is the oxygen that fuels the fire of terrorist plotting, and our sanctions help deprive terrorist groups of the funds they need to conduct attacks. In September of 2019, the president signed an executive order that greatly expanded our ability to sanction terrorists and their financial backers. It was the most significant upgrade to our terrorism sanctions authorities since the aftermath of 9/11. This administration has used our sanctions tools more aggressively than any before us. Since 2017, state has completed more than 100 CT actions. That includes 43 designations related to ISIS, 30 aimed at al-Qaeda, and 25 for Iran and its proxies, including 12 for Hezbollah. Treasury likewise has completed nearly 200 counterterrorism designation actions, including 58 for ISIS, 10 AQ, 9 Hamas, and 100 related to Hezbollah. We've particularly focused on squeezing the Iranian regime, which remains the world's worst state sponsor of terrorism. Nevertheless, its ability to shed blood has been vastly curtailed. That's because the State Department has taken unprecedented steps to starve it and its proxies of resources. In April 2019, we designated the IRGC, including its Quds Force, as a foreign terrorist organization. It was the first time we've ever applied these sanctions to part of another government. We've also mobilized governments around the world to take action against Hezbollah. As a result of our diplomacy, countries are seeing Hezbollah for what it is, a terrorist organization, full stop. More than a dozen countries from the Americas to Europe have now banned or designated Hezbollah in its entirety, rejecting the false distinction between a military wing and a so-called political one. Hezbollah is feeling the pinch. Its Secretary General, Hassan Nasrallah, has admitted as much, issuing rare public pleas for donations. We've also ratcheted up the pressure on ISIS. In March of 2020, the State Department designated Muhammad Saeed Abdel-Rahman al-Mallah, the group's new leader. We're also working to multilateralize our sanctions at the UN. We were proud to lead the UN's designation of 6 ISIS branches in 2019 and 2020, the first time the United Nations has ever sanctioned ISIS affiliates. And while I've talked about Islamist terrorists, it's important to note that we're using our sanctions tools against all terrorist threats, regardless of ideology. Last April, we designated the Russian Imperial Movement, or RIM, along with 3 of its leaders. RIM is a white supremacist group based in St. Petersburg that has trained people to commit acts of terrorism. It also has its eyes on the United States. Here's a fact that's out there in the public domain, but deserves to be better known. According to press accounts, RIM contacted organizers of the 2017 Charlottesville rally to invite them to its training camp. We've also worked to limit RIM's ability to use social media to promote its bloody agenda. A RIM leader told an American journalist that one of the most devastating impacts of the designation was that Facebook shut down its page, resulting in the loss of years' worth of information and hampering the group's reach. You're welcome. The RIM designation was the first time the United States ever sanctioned white supremacist terrorists, and it illustrates how seriously the State Department takes what we call racially or ethnically motivated terrorism, or REMT. Countering terrorist travel is another top priority. By keeping terrorists from crossing borders, by limiting their global mobility, we protect not only our own homeland, but our partners as well. A rising tide of border security lifts all boats. In December 2017, the State Department led the drafting and adoption of UN Security Council Resolution 2396, a landmark resolution that requires all UN member states to use border security tools that the United States has pioneered and has been using for years, in some cases decades. Things like establishing watch lists and analyzing airline reservation data. 2396 internationalizes the American approach to border security. It's the most important resolution on terrorist travel that the UN has ever adopted. And since then, we've been working hard to make sure this resolution is implemented fully and expeditiously. Thanks to American leadership, the International Civil Aviation Organization last year adopted new standards for airline data known as passenger name records, or PNR. PNR is the most important border security tool you've never heard of. It helps border security officials identify potentially risky travelers attempting to infiltrate their homelands. And these new standards provide a roadmap for countries that want to deploy this critical tool. We're also working bilaterally to boost our partners' ability to combat terrorist travel. Over the past 4 years, the State Department has expanded information sharing with foreign partners on known or suspected terrorists. We've now signed a total of 70 arrangements under Homeland Security Presidential Directive 6, or HSPD 6, to share watch lists. These relationships allow us to cast a global net for terrorists and detect their movements far from American shores. We've also given foreign partners a key tool that DHS uses to protect our own borders. It's called ATSG, and it analyzes PNR and other data to flag travelers who deserve a little extra scrutiny when they attempt to cross a border. Since 2017, we've provided or planned ATSG assistance in over 15 countries in Africa, Europe, and South America. Finally, one of our most effective programs against terrorist travel is PISES. That stands for Personal Identification, Secure Comparison, and Evaluation System. Now that's a mouthful, but what it is a complete border management system modeled on systems we use in the US that we offer to partner countries facing a high risk of terrorist travel. Every day, more than 300,000 travelers worldwide are processed through PISES-equipped border control sites in 24 countries. The program yields concrete results. In February of 2020, the Afghanistan Border Police arrested a senior Taliban member when he triggered a match in the PISES system as he attempted to depart for Pakistan. Next, the criminal justice system is a critical counterterrorism tool. Holding terrorists accountable for their crimes in courts of law is one of the most effective ways we know of to take threats off the street. And that's why the State Department has worked to build our partners' capabilities to investigate, prosecute, and adjudicate terrorism crimes. We want their police officers to be able to respond to attacks, stop the perpetrators, and protect the innocent. And we want their investigators, prosecutors, and judges to be able to try terrorists before courts of law and hold the guilty accountable for their crimes. Let me highlight a few real-world success stories. In Kenya, a US-funded unit responded to al-Shabaab's 2019 attack on the Dusit D2 hotel in Nairobi. This unit was able to greatly improve Kenya's response time and attack mitigation when compared to similar attacks on the Westgate Mall in 2014 and Garissa University in 2015. In Nigeria, US-trained police were key partners in the October 31st, 2020 raid by US Special Operations Forces that rescued an American hostage. They led the investigation, and provided security to the hostage and his family following the rescue. And in Afghanistan, we've trained and equipped a police unit that's making a major difference on the front lines. You might recall the ghastly ISIS attack on a maternity hospital in Kabul last May. This is the unit that responded to the attack. It neutralized the attackers, and it evacuated over 100 patients, including infants and their mothers. We've also worked with partner countries to boost their ability to prosecute terrorists for their crimes, and to do so in a way that fully respects human rights and the rule of law. In the Balkans, for instance, our assistance to prosecutors and judges has helped secure over 246 terrorist convictions since 2015. In Niger, we supported a mobile court of investigative judges, prosecutors, and security personnel to 2 high-security prisons to interview terrorism suspects. This team was able to close 140 dossiers with over 120 suspects now set to stand trial for terrorism crimes. In Mali, we funded and trained investigative judges who put together the legal case against the perpetrators of the 2015 attack on the Radisson Blu Hotel and the La Terrasse restaurant in Bamako. Another top priority has been the repatriation of foreign terrorist fighters from Syria to their home countries where they can face justice for their crimes. Repatriation and prosecution is the best way to make sure that these fighters can never again return to the battlefield. The United States has been leading by example. To date, we brought back 12 adult American citizens and 16 US minors from Syria and Iraq. 10 of the adults have been charged with federal crimes. 3 have pled or been found guilty, with the other cases still pending. We've also helped over a dozen countries repatriate roughly 800 of their own citizens. And we've supported them by building the capabilities they need to rehabilitate and reintegrate returning family members. Kazakhstan is a great example. Kazakhstan has been a world leader in bringing back its citizens. To date, it's brought home more than 500 family members of ISIS fighters from Syria. With our help, Kazakhstan has been offering them medical care, psychosocial support, educational opportunities, and other assistance. And we're providing similar help to a handful of other countries. Note that these measures are not a purely humanitarian gesture. They're also designed to protect to prevent the children of ISIS terrorists from becoming the next generation of fighters. So, in conclusion, what does the future hold? We've built a strong base for fighting terrorism over the past 4 years, but there's no room for complacency. First, we need to focus on Africa. As ISIS has lost its territory and power in Iraq and Syria, it's worked to strengthen its global branches, including in places like the Sahel and Mozambique. AQ's affiliates likewise remain resilient, including Al-Shabaab in Somalia and JNIM in the Sahel. These groups are exploiting undergoverned spaces, conflict zones, and security gaps, and we need to remain vigilant to stop them from plotting external operations. The de-ISIS coalition needs to play a leadership role here, albeit in a civilian capacity rather than a military one. Last November, the coalition met to discuss the security situation in West Africa, and we'll be mobilizing our collective expertise and resources to help our partners on the front lines. We'll need to continue that momentum going forward. Second, we need to keep up the pressure on Iran and its terrorist proxies like Hezbollah. The time has come to abandon the useful fiction that Hezbollah has a peaceful political wing that we can do business with. It doesn't, and we can't. Thanks to our diplomacy, more than a dozen countries have joined us in designating Hezbollah in its entirety. We'd like to see more join that club, particularly in Europe, particularly the European Union. Third, we need to make sure that CT remains an urgent priority. We've entered an era of great power competition in which China and other state rivals will consume the lion's share of policymakers' attention. But counterterrorism and great power competition are not mutually exclusive. CT is a comparative advantage for our country. We want to be the security partner of choice, and we provide capabilities that no rival can match. In part, that means equipment that actually works. But more fundamentally, the American approach to counterterrorism involves boosting our friends until they can stand up on their own. We don't want vassal states. We want sovereign, independent partners that are capable of defeating the threats they face. This kind of security cooperation can forge durable relationships that blunt our rivals' malign ambitions. Finally, in this volatile terrorist environment, we need to remain alert to new threats as they evolve and emerge. There are no JV terrorists. There are no geographic limits to terrorism. And so eternal vigilance isn't just the price of freedom, it's also the price of security. Thanks very much for being here today, and I look forward to our conversation.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, for your remarks. And just while he gets situated, I wanted to offer up a reminder to our listeners and viewers how to submit questions. So if you're looking to submit a question for the session today, please email them to chris.gavin@aei.org or submit them over the Twitter hashtag #StateCT@AEI. And then, just in reflection, after the conversation or the remarks from Ambassador Sales, how much we've done on various fronts with terrorism. And I will turn it over to Bruce very shortly here. But as somebody who focuses almost primarily on the Salafi jihadi front, so Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State, it is quite telling how much we see crossover between Al-Qaeda and the terror threat backed by Iran, and then also now the racially or ethnically motivated terrorism fronts. So Bruce, wondering if you have some initial observations on our counterterrorism successes here.
Sure. Thanks, Katie. And thank you, Ambassador Sales, for those remarks. I'd also like to thank the ambassador and his team for their leadership in counterterrorism in recent years. I think that they built upon a very effective foundation. And one of the things that worked most smoothly in our foreign policy has been our unrelenting focus on counterterrorism globally, and especially the degrading of ISIS and diminishment of other terrorist threats. I mean, I don't disagree certainly with anything that Ambassador Sales has said. I suppose I would, from my perspective, obviously not being a government official, but an academician, I'd like to reflect on the fact that we're approaching now the 20th anniversary, of course, of the September 11th, 2001 attacks. And I think it's revealing that even though we haven't won this war, we also haven't lost. But as we enter the third decade, it continues apace. I think one of the distinguishing features of the current administration's approach to counterterrorism, one of its successes, has been, as Ambassador Sales described, what was really this unrelenting targeted assassination of more than a half dozen leading terrorist commanders and figures. Ambassador Sales left out, for example, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the founder and leader of ISIS, which was tremendous. And certainly, I think, as we've seen throughout the past 20 years, the United States has been remarkably successful in its tactical degrading and diminishment of this threat. It's the strategic one, and one, of course, that Katie focuses on. It's winning the ideological struggle and really depriving these groups of the resonance and their ability to replenish their ranks, to marshal their resources to carry on the struggle. Now, that's not a criticism. I think that the State Department and certainly the 2018 National Strategy for Counterterrorism gave us a very clear blueprint and foundation to do so. But I think, as has always been the case, is that long-term strategic goal of breaking the cycle of replenishment that has locked us, after all, into what our adversaries themselves have categorized as a war of attrition is and remains the fundamental challenge.
I think that's certainly something to look at. And, in terms of generating strategic change on the counterterrorism front, I look at everything that the U.S. has tried to do, and particularly the State Department internationally, since when we're looking at this theater, and it's where, I'm very thankful that we have Ambassador Sales in those shoes and not me. The amount of footwork that has to be done in bringing partners on board, especially when we're looking at who is a terrorist. It's something that's very difficult to get quite agreement on. And I think one of the remarks that Ambassador Sales made was kind of the role of the future of the de-ISIS coalition, shifting it from a military role and much more into the civilian role, as we have shifted away from the military fight itself in Iraq and Syria and into the kind of soft underbelly of how the Islamic State has grown externally among the branches, which I know has been a focus for the State Department and the coalition. And the increasing burden that I think the State Department now bears in terms of both continuing to do, and I really appreciated the remarks about the programs that we've never heard about So all of the work on law enforcement and border security, which, as a once frequent traveler, I very much, didn't see the effect of it. But getting our partners to adopt policies that may not be beneficial to them in the short term, but certainly help build global security is critical. So I think, and I'll turn it over to Ambassador Sales just shortly here, so he can kind of enrich our discussion. But from a pure terrorist standpoint, we had started doing that work primarily to counter Al Qaeda and then the Islamic State. But I think it's going to pay dividends writ large as we're watching as global networks outside of the Salafi jihadi ideology are using the same tactics. Since with terrorism, it's really a blueprint that you can move across ideologies.
What's truly remarkable about the landscape that Ambassador Sales described is that, for instance, 5 years ago, we would have been talking about Al Qaeda and ISIS. 10 years ago, we would have just been talking about Al Qaeda. 15 years ago, just Al Qaeda. But Ambassador Sales laid out what is, a very broad agenda that counterterrorism has become to dealing with threats, not just from Salafi jihadis, but as he described, from racially and ethnically motivated terrorists from Iran as well. One could add to that a variety of single issue terrorists as well, radical anarchist or left-wing movements too. And what we see, I think, is a highly challenging landscape at a time, of course, when the luxury of focusing exclusively on Al Qaeda and then on Al Qaeda and ISIS has long passed us. So I would say that his successors will face enormous challenges because their attention a priori is going to have to be divided by this really myriad of threats that has surfaced and unfortunately has also grown over the past several years.
And then Ambassador, just over to you with that lay down. And also, I think just drawing out a little bit further some of Bruce's remarks here, but you mentioned it, we're shifting our resources away from counterterrorism to support competition. But the terrorism front has now mutated, evolved, changed, become so much more complicated, which means that we can't just have one person looking at this. So what does that mean in terms of resourcing our counterterrorism protocols and eliminating the risk that the US really exposes itself to the threat of international terrorism?
Right. Well, thanks, Bruce. Thanks, Katie, for putting all those issues on the table. I'm not sure how much time I've got. I could probably spend another 30 minutes teasing out all the nuances and implications of the things you've raised. So let me try and be brief. One of the things that's, I think, characterized the American approach to counterterrorism since 9/11 has been an awful lot of policy continuity across administrations of very different orientations overall, from Bush to Obama to Trump and now on to Biden. I'm not offering predictions about what the incoming team is likely to do, but the basic core of American counterterrorism, if you set aside some of the issues that are very high profile, such as Guantanamo Bay or interrogation policy during the Bush years, if you set aside the headlines, the basic architecture of American counterterrorism has been remarkably durable and stable. And it's things that most people who pick up the New York Times may never have heard of. I mentioned border security and passenger name record data. I'd like to see the polling data on how many people recognize that acronym, but it's responsible as much as anything else for keeping Al Qaeda fighters, ISIS fighters outside of the United States on the other side of the border. The same with sanctions. This actually is something that this administration has really intensified. Sanctions have long been a key tool in the CT toolkit, but I think the past 4 years have really been a proof of concept that this can be a central foreign policy tool, certainly when it comes to CT and other security challenges, but don't overlook the human rights dimension as well. The sanctions actions that this administration is most strongly associated with are security ones. We think of Iran, we think of North Korea, the maximum pressure campaign, but lurking just below the surface is an incredibly extensive body of human rights actions that this administration has taken with respect to the Chinese Communist Party's persecution of Muslim Uyghurs in China, efforts to eradicate democracy and basic freedoms in Hong Kong, GLOMAG sanctions related to Russia, violations of human rights there, and so on. So I think the CT sanctions that I've mentioned are likely to be with us as a key tool for the foreseeable future. And then the last thing maybe I could react to concerns how do we continue to make the case for counterterrorism as a top funding priority and other priority at a time when we're dealing with all these other issues that we just mentioned. I think in some ways, in many ways even, the choice between, do we fight terrorists on the one hand or do we resist great power encroachment by rivals on the other is a false choice because counterterrorism is one of the ways that we can compete with our rivals. We do CT better than anybody else. We can provide capabilities to those Sahelian states, to Mozambique, to countries in the Indo-Pacific region that nobody else can match. And I think that as countries, well, they recognize it already, but as they continue to act on that recognition and align themselves with the American security blanket, as it were, that helps serve not just counterterrorism objectives, it helps serve our broader geopolitical objectives as well. So, the case I would make to the incoming team, not that they're paying me for it, is take China seriously, but CT is one of the ways to take China seriously.
That lines up with an argument that I've made, especially looking at the challenges that you laid out in the Sahel, for example, where American interests are primarily rooted in counterterrorism. Why do we care about that region? It's because of the expansion of both the Islamic State and Al-Qaeda, and the demand from our partner, the French, who are leading the counterterrorism fight, particularly in that region, and to frame our resourcing just in terms of competition means that we will end up shifting resources away from an area where we do have a vital issue for US national security. And I think that one of the ways that I've tried to argue for reframing the competition issue is, the US needs to ensure that it is exerting its own interests, and counterterrorism in many parts of the world is a way for us to engage with partners who are looking for assistance within their borders, since many of these groups threaten actually a local partner much more than they threaten the United States as they're developing.
Well, if I could interject, don't forget too that twice in the past year, 18 months, we've identified members of Al-Shabaab taking flying lessons in the Philippines on one occasion and then in an undisclosed African country, seeking to replicate precisely the events of September 11th, 20 years ago. So the threat still is pointed at the homeland.
I'm really glad you brought that up, Bruce, because it points up the need to keep the pressure on these AQ and ISIS affiliates, because if we're not making them play defense, they're going to start playing offense. That is to say, they will plot external operations. And the case that you just mentioned involving the flight training is one that has been very concerning to us in government for some time now. I was glad to see the Justice Department announce charges against an individual who received flight training for that would-be 9/11 style attack. That's not to say that we can ease up on the pressure, but it is to say we have the tools at our disposal to keep the pressure on these adversaries.
And I think it just speaks to the continued necessity of some of the now 2 decades old efforts to secure global transit and the ability of these various networks to exploit some of the things that we enjoy in a globalized world. So aviation security is certainly one of them, border security another, but also now increasingly, as we've seen and as you mentioned with the Russian Imperial Movement designation, the ability to move across the cyber domain. So we're looking at what 20 years ago would have been very segmented terror threats, where we have groups that are racially motivated or ethnically motivated abroad, focusing on their own issues. But now they're reaching back and seem to be creating a more global effort to shift what were very local issues into a transnational threat. And there are also cases that I know of where they have looked to either Iranian-backed groups or Al-Qaeda or the Islamic State to learn from their tactics and bring them into their own ability. So While we think of all these terror threats in different silos, certainly, these organizations are eyes open in terms of how they can learn and how they can improve.
Well, let me jump in on that. I think you're exactly right, Katie. The white supremacist, the REMT terrorist groups across the world have been watching what ISIS has been doing with social media, and they've learned the TTPs, right? The tactics, techniques, and procedures that ISIS used to really communicate with and inspire like-minded radicals across the world. And we're seeing that with the white supremacist terrorist movement, transnational terrorist movement as well. It's not a coincidence, I don't think, that one of the groups that's part of this white supremacist terrorist firmament is known as the base. And if that sounds familiar, it should, because that's the English rendition of Al-Qaeda.
Yeah, well, we all know that Al-Qaeda likes to think of itself as the base, and I'm writing an article now on Al-Qaeda after 10 years after the Arab Spring, and just went back through some of the Abbottabad documents where it was complaining about just being called Al-Qaeda and not its full organizational name, which is the base for the organization of jihad, and it wants to be known by something else. But as we're just about to shift into question and answer, I do think that there are some interesting aspects to your experience during your time, Ambassador Sales, to draw forward, which is taking our counterterrorism tools and applying them to new threats, but also facing some of the same challenges that we faced when we started to apply those tools against Al-Qaeda in the 2000s, where we are actually yielding some significant successes in making it more difficult for these groups to operate, disrupting their activities, and bringing partners on board, so forming a coalition of the willing to really counter these groups. But it's unclear how successful we will be in actually changing the tide against them, particularly as we implement new policies, and these groups certainly are alive and they adapt on the ground. So, if you have any insights to share on how you've been able to look at some of the successes that you've had, but also some of the challenges that keep recurring.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think I can probably scratch the surface of it, but let me try and scratch away. The toolkit that we use is flexible and adaptable and durable. So, when you talk about, for instance, counterterrorism sanctions, you can use that tool against any type of threat. The tool is threat agnostic. And so the architecture that we built for sanctions or border security or law enforcement investigation and prosecution or capacity building, when we do all of that stuff to counter Al-Qaeda, it also equips our partners, also equips us with the capabilities that we need to address a wide range of terrorist threats, whether it's Shia terrorists like Hezbollah or other Iranian proxies, or an ISIS affiliate, or any emerging threat. So threat agnosticism, I think, is really one of the real benefits of the American approach to counterterrorism. It gives us a toolkit that can be deployed as needed as the threat situation evolves and adapts. What are some of the challenges? In the international space, I guess I would highlight two. One is Hezbollah, which is also a success story for us, I think. And the other is foreign terrorist fighters, which is also a success story for us. I've been incredibly encouraged by the dozen or more countries that have said enough is enough when it comes to Hezbollah. We're not going to blind ourselves to reality. We're going to call it for what it is. It's a terrorist organization, root and branch. So we're grateful to countries like Germany and the United Kingdom and many others in Europe and in South America. But we need more. We need more countries. And it's not that our other partners disagree with our assessment that Hezbollah is a single and unified organization. It's that they do not want to take the action that would necessarily follow from such a recognition. I described the notion that there's a political wing and a military wing as a useful fiction. That really is what it is. It's a fiction because it's false, but for some countries, I think it is a useful policy that allows them to maintain the status quo. And we hope that the incoming administration will continue to push on this front. Foreign terrorist fighters is another area where we've made great progress, but we should make more. I mentioned the 800 fighters and family members that have been repatriated to their countries of origin. I am so proud to work with countries like Kazakhstan, and I also would be proud to work with countries in Western Europe that so far have been rather reluctant to take their citizens back. Which was kind of a surprise, given that these are countries that, like the United States, have good resources. Like the United States, they have capable lawyers and courts and prison officials. Like the United States, they have systems of justice that are consistent with the rule of law and have stood the test of time. It really ought to make us all scratch our heads when an emerging democracy, an emerging economy like Kazakhstan is leading the charge, and the established democracies of the West are looking around at each other. So, I'd like to see in the future more progress be made on the fighters and families too.
If I could jump in just with something about future challenges, I think that Ambassador Sales' successor in particular is going to face something that we haven't seen before, that the differences or the distinction between domestic and international terrorism is eroding. For all intents and purposes, given social media, there's no such thing as a wholly domestic terrorist organization. If you look at a group like the Base, for example, that Ambassador Sales just mentioned, it has a U.S. citizen as its leader. It's based in St. Petersburg, Russia. It has members from the United States and for other countries. And of course, given United States laws and constitutional freedoms, makes it very difficult to move against a group that has a salient or even a partial U.S. representation. And Atomwaffen, I would argue, is very much the same. So this is, I think, is one issue. The second issue, which many of Ambassador Sales's remarks also alluded to, is what we see as the increasing convergence of different terrorist groups that are sharing common enemies, and in some cases, even common sources of animus. I mean, an easy and a very clear one, of course, is anti-Semitism, which is shared by Salafi jihadis, neo-Nazis and racists, as well as Iran and Hezbollah. But I mean, think of it, many of these groups are constantly embarking on a search for new constituencies. And it's remarkable to me, whether it's Salafi jihadis or the far right, for example, that they're increasingly gravitating towards climate issues and ecological issues. So we can see a convergence. We like to, compartmentalize or categorize terrorist organizations and movements very neatly. And for the past 50 or 60 years, we've been able to separate domestic from international, Salafi jihadi from far right from far left, from nationalist separatists. But what we're seeing now, largely because of social media and because of the digital revolution, is a convergence that's going to challenge some of those categorizations and some of the way we do business and we've done business, the business of counterterrorism in the past.
Well, certainly it's not going to be easy going forward. I wanted to open it up to questions from the audience, and I'll take our first one from Jeff Selden, who's at Voice of America. And Jeff writes in, that Secretary Pompeo spoke of an axis between Iran and al-Qaeda, calling Iran al-Qaeda's new home base, and saying that it poses a grave threat. But Ambassador James Jeffrey, who just stepped down in November, said the other day that none of the intelligence was new and that these are transactional in nature. They're not a joint campaign about the United States. And this goes to some of what Bruce was just laying out in terms of convergent interests between some of these groups. And this November, Ambassador Sales, you said that al-Qaeda's central leadership mattered less than it used to and was on the ropes. So the question from Jeff is, what's the disconnect and what has happened to change in the past several months that makes al-Qaeda in Iran a more urgent threat today?
Well, thanks for the question, and appreciate the reference to Jim's comments. Jim's a friend. Jim is my predecessor as Special Presidential Envoy to the Global Coalition. All I can tell you is that Jim, having left the government some months ago, is no longer privy to the conversations that are taking place between policymakers at the State Department and career intelligence officials who are providing the intelligence assessments that formed the basis of the Secretary's speech the other day. We're talking about intel here, which means I can't say much more than that. But it is simultaneously the case that Iran is the home base for Al-Qaeda, and that Al-Qaeda's global network of branches and affiliates are more important to the enterprise today than they were in 2001. We are seeing a bit more of a, I don't want to call it entrepreneurial spirit, because entrepreneurialism is good, but we're seeing more independence among the affiliates to determine their tactical moves to advance the overall Al-Qaeda enterprise's strategic objectives. That is happening, that is true, but it is also the case, as the secretary revealed earlier this week, that Al-Qaeda and the regime in Tehran have made common cause. And it shouldn't surprise us that the regime would support this particular Sunni terrorist organization, because it's been supporting Sunni terrorist organizations for years. Think of groups like Hamas or Palestine Islamic Jihad. This is just part of a longer effort by the leading state sponsor of terrorism to support terrorism.
And I think, if we look at Al-Qaeda and the Iran relationship, it certainly goes back decades, where Hezbollah provided the training for the Al-Qaeda in East Africa bombers in 1998. And certainly they've made common cause in other theaters. The next question comes from Senate Foreign Relations Committee staffer Colin Brooks, focusing on the recent announcement regarding Yemen and the Houthis. And Colin writes, given that the al-Houthis don't rely on US financial networks or travel, what's the technical, practical intent of the designation? What resources do such a designation deny the Houthis that justifies the potential fallout? And he's talking there, I think, about the potential fallout on the humanitarian side, much less so on the political negotiations, since as a Yemen watcher for many years, I know the Houthis have not participated in those negotiations in good faith.
Well, you've stolen my line, Katie. Let me say a few words about the benefits of the designation and the strategic goals that's intended to accomplish, as well as what we're doing to address the humanitarian situation in Yemen that the Houthis have created and are exacerbating. Look, our objective in Yemen remains unchanged. We want a negotiated end to the violence, a political solution that brings all of the relevant stakeholders within Yemen to the table to produce a solution that they can all live with. The Houthis don't want that. We know they don't want that because we've been able to watch their behavior. They have refused to meet with the UN Special Envoy in charge of the Yemen negotiations, Martin Griffiths. They've refused to meet with American diplomats to continue our diplomatic push for a negotiated settlement. They have, while refusing diplomacy, intensified their use of Iran-supplied weapons to conduct terrorist attacks. And let's call them what they are. They are terrorist attacks. If you're shooting missiles at airports or at energy infrastructure, you're a terrorist. And the most recent example of that, of course, is also one of the most vivid. They launched an attack on the Aden airport seeking to decapitate the Yemeni government, which had just landed there. And the only reason they weren't successful is because their aim was bad, and instead ended up killing more than 20 innocent civilians at the airport, including 3 aid workers from the International Committee of the Red Cross. So why are we designating them as terrorists? Because they're terrorists. Now, in doing this, we're of course mindful of the fact that Yemen has long suffered from a humanitarian crisis. Make no mistake, it's the Houthis that are responsible for creating and exacerbating this humanitarian crisis. The United States is going to do everything in our power to alleviate the suffering of the Yemeni people. Just last year, we provided more than $600 million in assistance to the Yemenis. And we're going to continue to do that. We were the largest humanitarian donor in the country, and we're going to continue to be the largest humanitarian donor. More particularly, the U.S. government is going to put in place licenses and mitigation measures that will ensure that the aid provided to Yemen can continue to flow. We don't want the people of Yemen to suffer because of the terrorism that the Houthis commit.
That is significant. I think, and I've raised it myself, but the example of the Afghan Taliban, which conducted terrorist attacks, which we have, instead of designated as an FTO, we sat down and negotiated with them. but that's probably a much longer conversation for another day. Another question that's come in from Kyle Bolia at USAID is that given the massive security failure last week in the Capitol, and looking at the remarks that Bruce has made about the breakdown of the lines between domestic and international terrorism, as well as the connection between the Russian imperial movement and Charlottesville, which I hadn't been following myself. How would you recommend, Ambassador, that the interagency focus on dealing with the growing threat of the international terrorist movement coming here and manifesting domestically?
Yeah, it's a great question. I can answer about half of it. The part that involves our efforts overseas. Here at home, DOJ and DHS and the FBI really take the lead in coordinating the U.S. government response to domestic threats. As Bruce points out, and he's exactly right, the distinction between purely domestic and purely foreign has been under pressure for some time and is beginning to crumble. I mean, frankly, we saw some of that in the aftermath of 9/11 when we had to retool our surveillance authorities to account for new communications technologies and new patterns of terrorist organization movements. But I think that problem is now scaling up. And the distinction between domestic and foreign is becoming more difficult to maintain. What do we do about racially or ethnically motivated terrorism or white supremacist terrorism overseas? Well, I've said part of it already, and that's we designate the people who and the groups who meet our legal and policy criteria for designation. We announced the RIM designation last year. It was the first. It shouldn't be the last. We should continue to, and I've told my team here at State, we need to continue to identify potential targets for designation. Bring me targets, I will sign the paperwork. Another part of it is engaging with vulnerable audiences who might be susceptible to radicalization. And one of the most effective ways that we are able to do this is the testimony of formers. People who have entered the white supremacist movement, have been part of it, and then realized the error of their ways, and then left. People like that, the formers, are incredibly powerful spokespeople that can dissuade vulnerable populations from succumbing to this radicalization. And we've been working with an organization known as the Strong Cities Network. It does CVE work globally to send out some of these former white supremacists, also former jihadis too, to tell their stories, and it really resonates with audiences. And then there's the counter messaging piece that you have to do online. I mentioned that one of the most important consequences of the RIM designation was they were deplatformed by Facebook. Well, good. We should be deplatforming people who are in violation of U.S. sanctions. But beyond that, the best remedy for objectionable speech is counter speech. We need to be developing and propagating credible alternative narratives like the ones that the formers can offer, not just in real space, but in social media channels as well. So we're working on that with Silicon Valley too. That is a thumbnail sketch answer to a very big question. But I can tell you that our European and other foreign partners are very focused on the REMT threat, just as we are. So I would expect this to be a growth industry in the coming years.
I think especially as research is showing that particularly Russia and Putin are pushing on the REMT threat because of the effects that it generates, especially with our European partners. And to look back at some of my work, how it benefits the Islamic State and Al-Qaeda to have some of the societal divisions exacerbated by both Russia pushing in on Europe and kind of the convergence between REMT and frankly the Islamic State in certain populations to radicalize and create this and or situation where you are either identifying with a certain group or you are another group. But unfortunately, this is such a big topic. So counterterrorism, international counterterrorism, I could sit here for hours and talk through all of the ins and outs of our policies, and I know Bruce could at least write another book on it. So
I would buy that book.
You should. And I want to give each of you just a few minutes at the end to provide any concluding remarks. So perhaps, Bruce, I'll turn it over to you, just kind of high-level observations from this conversation, and then we'll turn it to Ambassador Sales to close.
Sure. Thanks, Katie, also for organizing this great event. As we approach the 20th anniversary of the 9/11 attacks, understandably, I think there's a sense of fatigue and enervation, desire to move on. But I think everything, certainly I've heard in the past hour, but that all of us know as analysts of terrorism and counterterrorism, is that the war on terrorism is far from over. I mean, look at ISIS. We were so successful in destroying the caliphate, in degrading ISIS's military power in the Levant in Iraq. But what have we seen in recent years, despite not just our efforts, but the Herculean efforts of what Ambassador Sales has described now as an 83-country coalition? ISIS has just continued to spread. I mean, ISIS was not present in Sri Lanka, in Indonesia, in Mozambique, the Central African Republic, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Cameroon, and so on. So we're dealing with protean enemies who certainly have not laid down their arms. And as then General Mattis very famously said back in 2013, the enemy always gets a vote. And I think incontrovertibly, whether it's ISIS, whether it's Al-Qaeda, whether it's the other challenges and threats that are arising, they have voted to continue the struggle. I mean, it may be simple for us to declare it over, but that doesn't mean our enemies see it over. So there's a lot more competition for our resources and attention than there's been at any other time on the war on terrorism, but it's not a time to let up on the success that we've had. Again, as I've argued, more tactical than strategic, but we need to rededicate ourselves to really being as effective strategically and in the long term and breaking that cycle I described, as we have been, I think, remarkably successful tactically.
Ambassador Sales, closing remarks?
I don't think I have anything to add to what I've already said and what you, Katie, and Bruce have said. I'm grateful to you both for joining me for the conversation, and to our audience for listening and posing those questions. It's been the honor of a lifetime to serve here at the State Department as the Ambassador at Large and Coordinator for Counterterrorism. I hope that as I transition back into private life on next Wednesday, that AEI will always welcome my contributions to these debates, and Georgetown as well. So let me plug the fact that we've only begun to scratch the surface of this conversation. We're probably going to have more of these events in the future.
We certainly will. And I really want to thank you for your years now of service. And I know a lot of it has been behind the scenes and doing some very, just slogging work in the diplomatic front. But certainly the successes are here, since as a civilian, I am benefiting from American security writ large. And that's due in large part to the work of government officials who never get thanked. So let me say thank you. And thank you to Bruce as well for his longtime contributions to the terrorism field, but also for joining us for this hour today in this conversation. And I hope to have you both back at AEI, hopefully in person at some point, in a future conversation where we can talk about our strategic successes against some of these terrorist threats. Thank you all for joining us, and have a good afternoon.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.